planning process, because that's something that we do both internally in our work with individuals and in our work with involved family members. So the topic is people with developmental disabilities in the police, maximizing effectiveness of communication and protecting safety and interactions with law enforcement. Fairly wordy title. Not all of the content is specifically geared toward people with developmental disabilities. A lot of it deals with people with disabilities more broadly, and a lot of it deals with the rights and the rights that each of us has as a citizen. But there are some points where we're going to focus a little bit on issues that are more specific to people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disability, the autism spectrum. So we wanted to make sure that we covered that population, because very often when the topic is discussed, there's much more of a focus on people with psychiatric diagnoses, partially because that's kind of where a lot of the encounters that go bad have occurred, but there have been incidents, we'll discuss some of them, where it's equally relevant to individuals with developmental disabilities. So this is the third in a series of 4 webinars focusing on issues of safety. There's going to be another one a week from today. I'll tell you about that at the very end. But this is an activity of the collaborative, which is the Region 1 Parent Training and Information Center of New York State. New York State, the parent training and information programs exist in every state. The funding for it comes from the federal government under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in New York State, there are 2 PTI programs for Region 1, which consists of Nassau, Suffolk counties on Long Island, and New York City. Region 2 consists of the rest of the state, the Hudson Valley, the Western New York, the entire rest of the state, the whole upstate area. So we're in Region 1, and we're part of a collaborative of 4 programs that operate independently, but with coordination and collaboration between them. 3 in New York City, Advocates for Children of New York, include NYC, and of course Synergia, which has its parent programs in the Metropolitan Parent Center. And then serving Nassau and Suffolk, you have the Long Island Advocacy Center. Each organization has a slightly different focus. Obviously, LIAC, Long Island Advocacy Center, has a geographic focus that's different than the New York City focus. But the New York organizations, we each have different strengths and have different specializations. So you can access services directly from each of the organizations. The contact information is on the slide. And there's a variety of supports and services that are available, from training like this to parent leadership development, resources and information referral that's targeted to the unique issue that the parent calls with, videos and publications, youth training, live trainings in a variety of locations, and individual assistance, which can include attendance at meetings and assistance with due process. So getting into the topic, I think our goal in approaching the topic overall is really to maximize safety while safeguarding rights. Each of us has rights as a citizen to be treated with respect, to not be subject to scrutiny from law enforcement when it's not appropriate, and when it is appropriate to have certain protections. And we believe that that should apply to individuals with or without disabilities. There shouldn't be any distinction in the integrity of people's rights based on disability. So our goal is to safeguard the rights of individuals, but maximize safety, to ensure that people are not putting themselves at risk unnecessarily, that they're not put at risk because of factors that may create misunderstanding or miscommunication or fear. And that's kind of the topic of today: how to balance the two parts of the goal, and how to approach the issue. And we're not going to give you a list of 10 tips that will guarantee safety, because every individual is different. The factors that might put someone at risk are gonna vary. There's tremendous diversity among the population of people with developmental disabilities, even within the same subcategory. So it's really how to approach the issue, and how to initiate a process of safety planning and consider different factors. And it really is intended just to give parents a basis to begin thinking about it. So the objectives for the training are really to identify risk factors for youth and adults with developmental disabilities and encounters with the police in the community or home. Some of those are behavioral, some of those are more contextual. Understanding the basic rights of individuals and the powers of police. Again, not focused on individuals with disabilities, but on the rights that every citizen has. Identify strategies to prepare individuals for police interactions, steps to be taken in planning for safe encounters. And again, there's going to be tremendous variation, because parents may have an individual who has tremendously challenging behaviors, aggressive behaviors, behaviors that actually put that individual and others, including the police, at risk. And that is going to be a paramount consideration. There may be an individual who's nonverbal, and that's going to make things complicated in a different way. There may be an individual who there's a cognitive issue of comprehension and understanding the instructions of police or something like that. So every case is going to be different, and every strategy is going to be different. A parent would need to kind of make an assessment of how much capacity an individual has to implement the strategies that are identified, and kind of tailor the preparation to their needs and their readiness. And then finally, identify ongoing considerations in future planning to minimize the risk of unsafe encounters. And by that, I'm thinking of, in planning integration activities, in planning adult services, in planning in dealing with service providers, in ensuring that they're prepared to support the individual and minimize the risk of unsafe encounters. So that's kind of the overall list of specific objectives, and the agenda sort of follows. First, we'll talk a little bit about the context, why it makes sense to prepare an individual for police encounters. Second, we'll talk about knowing your rights. And again, these are the rights that the parent has, the child has, I have, everybody on the call has. The third is kind of tips on encounters with the police, best practices that are generally advisable for anyone interacting with the police. And again, how you convey that information to an individual is going to vary depending on their needs, their learning characteristics, et cetera. And then on kind of preparing youth for interaction with police, and finally, safety planning in a more general sense. Okay, So the context for the discussion today, a little bit of data. People with mental or physical disabilities are about 3 times as likely to be victims of violent crime as people without a disability, and that comes from the Department of Justice data. At least, so the likelihood that you're a victim of crime increases the likelihood you're going to interact with the police, and that's relevant because you know, for instance, we had an individual living in our community residence who had seizure disorder and found dealing with the police extremely stressful. One day, somebody snatched her cell phone on the street. The police were called. When she encountered the police, she had a seizure. And we realized there was a need to prepare her for the stress of the encounter, even though it wasn't her behavior that initiated the contact with the police, but she nevertheless found it a stressful encounter. We needed to begin a process of kind of normalizing that and helping her to deal with the anxiety that she had, I guess, since childhood about interacting with the police on her own. At least 1 in 3 youths arrested have a disability. Some research indicates the proportion may be much higher. The Heckinger report found that surveying the literature, there were estimates all over the place, but 1 in 3 was a conservative estimate. And about half the people who die as a result of encounters with the police have a disability, and that comes from the Ruderman Foundation. People with disabilities are at heightened risk of poverty and homelessness, which in turn puts them at higher risk of police surveillance and detention. And that comes from Disabled World, and it kind of it mirrors the real life experience that most of us have. That poor folks and definitely homeless folks are much more likely to be dealing with the police, and people with disabilities are statistically much more at risk of both homelessness and poverty. Okay, and I'll give you some examples, and these are cases that unfortunately I didn't have to look very far to find some examples, and I could have listed a lot more. It's important, I think, to look at these cases and to look at the circumstances, how they arose, what was happening, because it really is useful in kind of jogging your senses in terms of anticipating issues and thinking of things that could have been done differently, and in a planning sense, that makes a lot of sense to look at those cases and say, okay, to avoid that outcome, what could have been done differently, and in my own situation, what do I need to anticipate in order to minimize the chances of an encounter going the way these did. But Dynell Simmons, this happened in Suffolk County, out on the island. 29-year-old man with autism and intellectual disability living in a group home. The group home summoned the police because Dynell was banging on walls. He had become very upset. He calmed down. The police arrived. They said, well, since you called us, we have to take him to a psychiatric emergency room. Not entirely sure what they thought a psychiatric emergency room was going to do in a situation like that, given the nature of his disability. It probably wasn't the most appropriate place, but they didn't know. And they insisted on taking him into custody. He insisted on not being taken into custody. He ended up being tased a number of times, pepper sprayed. He lost consciousness and he died. Equally tragic, Ethan Saylor, 26-year-old man with Down syndrome, died of asphyxia when 3 off-duty sheriff's deputies who were working as security guards at a movie theater tried to arrest him because he he returned to the theater to see a second showing after paying for a ticket and seeing the first showing of, I think it was Zero Dark 30. He wanted to see the movie again. He insisted he was staying for a second showing. He assumed that the ticket gave him that right. They told him otherwise. It escalated. He ended up dying of asphyxia. Charlie McIllivery was a Toronto man who had, as a child, had a traumatic brain injury. He also had a hearing impairment. Police tried to question him and give him commands on the street. He became scared and tried to run away or move away quickly, and he ended up being beaten with batons and died as a result. His mother was with him. She was trying to explain that he couldn't hear very well and that he couldn't communicate verbally anyway, but things were happening too fast, and her warnings weren't heard. Divon Cieslak was a 13-year-old with cerebral palsy, also had mental health issues. Police had been called a number of times to his residence, and apparently one officer in particular was angry at having come out more than once. He was handcuffed in the back of a car, and the officer repeatedly punched him. Now, the officer lost his job, as he should have, but he wasn't prosecuted. But that was a case involving a very young, 13-year-old in Michigan. So there are tons of these cases, and a lot of cases involving people with psychiatric diagnoses, some cases involving individuals with cerebral palsy who are assumed to be drunk because of the effect on their speech, or there are many cases. And again, it's important to look at the factors in the cases and kind of apply them to your own lives and how it might affect the way your child is perceived, the way your child is responded to by law enforcement, and the things maybe you can do to anticipate difficulties and avoid them. Okay, so now we're getting into just the general topic of what your rights are as a citizen, and what the powers of the police are and what limits exist on those powers. You can only be arrested, or you should only be arrested, which means you're detained in the custody of the police. You don't have the right to leave if police have probable cause to believe that you've committed a crime. Now, there is a right of inquiry that's short of that, a right to inquire by law enforcement where they don't need probable cause to believe, that they don't have to have probable cause to arrest you in order to make inquiry. We'll talk about what that really means. In New York State, you're not required to carry or show identification unless you're driving. I mean, we're really talking about pedestrian encounters today. Driving, obviously, you have to be able to show that you're a licensed driver. But if you're on the street, you're not required to carry or show ID. If they do reach that threshold of probable cause and they're issuing you a summons, it's an offense or a violation that wouldn't necessarily result in arresting you and taking you into custody, just the issuance of a summons, you are required to establish your identity. And if you refuse to do so, then they have the right to take you into custody, and they will. Now, in terms of questioning that hasn't followed an arrest, hasn't followed a determination that they have probable cause to arrest you, you can be questioned if police have a reasonable suspicion that you have committed a crime, or you're about to commit a crime, or that you're in the process of committing a crime. It's a lower standard than probable cause. They do have the right to ask you for your name, your address, and an account of what you're engaged in, what you're doing, where you are. That can be done based on reasonable suspicion. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to be arrested to invoke the right to remain silent. You always have the right to not answer questions. You do not have to consent to a search of your person or belongings. And saying I do not consent. If the police have reason to search without consent, they can go ahead and do it. But if you assert that you're not consenting, it minimizes the risk that they'll say later that well, they gave consent to search the bag, or they gave consent to search the pocket. In New York City, you can ask for a business card from an officer who questions but does not arrest you. So if an officer asks you your name, your address, etc., you have the right to ask for a business card, and they're required to give it to you. In Nassau and Suffolk, I don't believe that's the case, but you can always ask for a badge number and a name. As a bystander, you have the right to film an encounter with the police as long as you don't interfere or get close enough to pose a threat. So you're not hovering over the shoulder, you're not within reach of the police, but you do have a right as a citizen to film an encounter. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy that people have on the street to not be filmed. So that's a right that people have, but again, you want to be very careful not to put yourself in a position where you could be accused of interfering with the arrest. You don't want to be instructing the individual who's the subject of the encounter, don't answer, don't listen to him, he doesn't have a right to, but you can film silently as long as you're not interfering. Okay. I want to go back to talking about the what's sometimes called the non-custodial interrogation, non-custodial inquiry, and the limited search that may come along with it. And I think one of the reasons one of the things I want to clear up is that there's been some confusion, I think, largely because of the controversy over stop and frisk. People think there was a change in the law a couple of years ago, and there really wasn't. There was a change in policy by NYPD. There was a change. There was action in federal court that sort of reinforced what the law always was, and resulted in I think, better adherence to the law by the NYPD. But the law never really changed, and that's it relates to what I talked about with the right of inquiry to ask questions when you have reasonable suspicion that a person is committing a crime, might be just about to commit a crime, or has committed a crime. And that comes from there was a Supreme Court case in, I think, 1967 called Terry v. Ohio. There was a similar case called Cibrone v. New York that kind of fleshed it out a little more, and that was also in the Supreme Court. And it dealt with the limited scope to questions and a search for weapons. And the statute that in New York State is most relevant. Basically, the Supreme Court cases established a threshold protection. So any state can pass a statute as long as it's consistent with what the Supreme Court says are your constitutional rights. And in New York State, the relevant statute is the New York Criminal Procedure Law, Section 140.50, which is headed "The Temporary Questioning of Persons in Public Places and Search for Weapons." And actually, even before the use of the phrase "stop and frisk" was very common, this was referred to as the stop and frisk statute in New York. And it reads as follows. Police officer may stop a person in a public place when he reasonably suspects that such person is committing, has committed, or is about to commit a felony or a misdemeanor, and may demand of him his name, address, and an explanation of his conduct. This is an old statute, so I think they only use masculine pronouns. When upon stopping a person, a police officer reasonably suspects that he is in danger of physical injury, he may search such person for a deadly weapon or any instrument, article, or substance readily capable of causing serious injury and of a sort not ordinarily carried in public places by law-abiding persons. So if you're, carrying an axe and you're nowhere near a woodpile, that, might be treated as a weapon. So it's the search, the right to search an individual, to frisk an individual, is really limited to the safety of the officer and the safety of anyone in the vicinity. It's not to look for evidence of a crime. So you don't have the right to search a book bag for marijuana, or to, what's in this little baggie or what's in this little envelope. It's a very superficial search to make sure somebody doesn't have a gun or a knife or a weapon of some kind. So it's not an in-depth search. The litigation and the policy changes about stop and frisk kind of, created the impression that there had been a change in the law and that, police had greater power, but the law never really changed. What happened was the NYPD, using a data-driven approach, accelerated the use of stop and frisk as a policy, and they, instead of being based on reasonable suspicion, which is really what the law says, it was based on statistical likelihood and being in a high crime area, being in an area where a lot of arrests had been made. And it became very self-fulfilling, because the more stops you make and the more arrests you make at a certain location, the more that location becomes a high crime area, and you can use it to justify further stop and frisks. So it in the opinion of the federal court, it had gotten kind of out of hand, and the opinion of the policymakers, it had gotten out of hand. So NYPD changed its policy and was directed to change its policy at about the same time in federal court. So the law never really changed. This is what it is. They have the right to, if they have a reasonable suspicion, so some reason for believing that you may be committing a crime or you may have committed a crime, they have the right to make inquiry, which you can respond to, or you can say, I choose not to answer any questions. And then they need to make a determination about probable cause. And if in making those inquiries, they have reason to believe that the safety of the officer may be in jeopardy, that officer has a right to pat you down, to frisk you for weapons, so that the encounter is safe. But it's not to look for evidence of crime. Okay. In terms of, and I should have said at the beginning, if there are questions, please write them in the chat box, because then at the end we'll be able to go back and kind of deal with some of the questions. Okay, in terms of keeping interactions with the police safe, these are basic tips that would apply to anybody. These are not tailored to individuals with a particular disability or any disability at all. Don't run. Don't run away from the police if you see them coming. Keep your hands in view. Don't make sudden movements. Don't shove your hands in your pockets. Don't shout, curse, insult the police. If you don't want to answer questions, tell them politely, I wish to remain silent. That's all you need to say. If they ask to search your pockets, your bag, your other belongings, tell them I do not consent to a search. Remember, if they may be able to pat you down for weapons only without consent, and they should tell you, I'm going to check your pockets because, I'm going to pat you down for weapons for my own safety and your safety. But they do have that right. They don't have to place you under arrest first. And if they are arresting you, they can conduct a full search. It's a search incident to arrest. They have that power. If you're unclear as to whether you're being arrested, because sometimes it's not clear to people, police are giving them instructions. If they, haven't told you you're under arrest, and they ask, "Can I look in your bag?" say, I do not consent to a search. They may say, I'm placing you under arrest, so it doesn't matter whether you consent, but you definitely want to be on the record that you're not consenting. And then never touch a police officer. I mean, if an officer is talking to you and you want to make a human connection, you don't put your hand on their shoulder or their hand on their arm. They need to maintain a distance and the ability to move if things change. So they're taught to avoid coming in contact, physical contact with people initiated by the people. So those are some of the tips. If you're not sure whether you're free to leave, which happens, I think, fairly often, ask whether you're under arrest. If the answer is no, ask if you're free to leave. If the answer to both questions really shouldn't be no. If they say, well, I just want to get an answer to a couple of questions, okay, fine. That's, the questions are your name, your address, and what you're doing where you are. You don't have to answer them, but they can't continue indefinitely to question you and to question you about other things, or ask you a million questions if they're not arresting you. If they are arresting you, don't resist, even if you think they're wrong. Even if you think, I didn't do it, they don't have probable cause, this is an illegal arrest, you don't resist on the scene. If it's a wrongful arrest, you deal with that later. If you're arrested, don't answer any questions without an attorney. If you believe your rights have been violated, don't argue about it at the scene. Ask for a business card, write down a badge number, whatever you need to do to document it. There are options to file a complaint later. Arguing it at the scene can cause things to escalate and make an arrest more likely, or some other unpleasant encounter. So some of the factors that come up, and here we'll get into more disability-specific factors, factors that make an interaction risky for the individual. Behaviors that actually create risk for the police or for the individual. So in the case of Dynell Simmons, when he was banging on the walls, that is a behavior that can create some risk. So that's something that needs to be considered in planning for his safety. Is that at a certain point, his frustration may be such that he'll lash out and bang on walls, or potentially put people around him at risk, act out in different ways. So those are the behaviors that can be extremely problematic and create risk. And again, it's something to be considered in safety planning. Behaviors that might be perceived as creating a risk for police. For instance, noncompliance with commands, furtive or evasive conduct. So for Charlie in Toronto, noncompliance with commands was he didn't respond verbally when he was asked to. He couldn't verbalize, so it was perceived as being noncompliance. It was actually an inability to comply. Furtive or evasive conduct. If somebody doesn't make eye contact, an officer without training may interpret that as he's being evasive. He's unwilling to look me in the eye. So those things may be perceived as creating a risk. Biasing and ignorance and lack of training. This kind of goes along with it. If people aren't aware of the nature of the disability or what the implications are, or they just have certain expectations and they're not being met, that kind of points to the need for training of law enforcement. We'll talk about that later. But that's a risk factor. Lack of socialization training for youth, including training, role play specific to the context. One of the things about poor socialization, David Hingsberger, who writes a lot about sexuality in people with developmental disabilities, has kind of made the point that one of the reasons that people with developmental disabilities, especially women, are much more likely to be victims of sexual abuse, and people with developmental disabilities, especially men, are much more likely to be falsely accused of sexual misconduct. And he believes that one of the reasons is that there are deficiencies in the way people with developmental disabilities are socialized, and that they may spend a lot of their time in segregated settings, maybe less so in, as time goes on, but in settings where the norms of boundaries and social expectations are kind of relaxed. So if someone's in a program where it's acceptable to hug your teacher every day when you come in, or it's acceptable to hug the staff, or to hug that may not prepare someone very well for more community-oriented activities where, going up and putting your arms around somebody may be perceived in a different way. So some of those socialization issues are things that we need to think about establishing the boundaries that people are expected to adhere to on the street. The other issue, I think, is there's some good stuff being done on training to prepare people for situations that they haven't encountered in the past. If people have only traveled with family, or they've only traveled in school groups, or they've only traveled as children when you're perceived differently. There's a need to get people ready for greater independence in the community, and some of that can be done through training and role play. Okay, absence of information for responding officers. If officers are dispatched to a scene and don't necessarily know what's happening, the information given to the dispatcher wasn't complete, the more they know, the better off they are, and the better off the individual is going to be. Lack of alternative crisis response measures. I mean, one of the reasons we're talking about this is that when there's a crisis, what you may need is a mobile crisis psychiatric team, or behavioral health professionals to come and support, and that's just not available. And what you get is emergency medical services, and in order to get that, you need police to respond. So, it would, in an ideal world, we would have a range of different responses, and there would be help available that's more appropriate to the situation. But the fact that those resources just don't exist in sufficient supply, which is an understatement, is a factor. And then individual characteristics, the size and the appearance of an individual. Dynell Simmons, when the story came out about his death, one of the first things that was released was he was 6'4" and 250 pounds. So that affects how somebody's going to be perceived. And in Dynell's case, he was also African American, which we know from the data and from the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the dialogue that's gone on around that race is always going to be a factor in interactions with police, or I shouldn't say always, but for the foreseeable future, it's a factor. It's something to be considered. Okay, in preparing youth to interact with the police, again, this is really basic, because there's no way that you could give somebody a roadmap how to prepare your child for interaction with the police, because it depends on the child's personality, the child's behavioral characteristics, how they're perceived. There's so many things that are going to go into it. Their capacity to communicate is going to be a big factor. So these are really just talking points to consider in beginning that process. Parents have the best knowledge of their child's behaviors and of what might trigger them or cause a situation to escalate. And these are important things to think about, to anticipate with a young person about, well, what would you do if this happened? You know, I know this upsets you. How would you deal with this if you were on your own in a public place? And those insights are going to be vital in planning for travel independence, community activities, you know, self-directed activities in the community, et cetera. Parents should recognize their child's going to be perceived differently by people in the community as they age, and as their sphere of activities expands. If your child has only ever really been out in public with you or with a trusted adult or family member, you should start to think about, well, what will change when he's not with me? He might be with a direct service provider, or he may be on his own. You know, how will he be perceived? And, you know, what issues does that raise in terms of preparation? And as you know, a young person engages in different types of activities, goes to different types of places, those are the kind of things that you want to think about. Parents should recognize the limitations of professional service providers to prevent risky interactions, and that includes school personnel, it includes direct service providers, et cetera. So if you say, well, I don't really need to prepare my child to interact with the police because he's going to a recreation program, there'll be staff around. You never know. I mean, you just, in any kind of group activity in the community, there's always the risk somebody might wander off. The staff member might be otherwise engaged. You know, they may be understaffed that day. There can be a range of different things that can happen that may make it more important that the youth be prepared for some kind of interaction with the police. Preparation should begin at a young age. You don't want to wait until somebody's a full-grown adult and actually going and doing things. It's something you want to start to prepare them for early. Parents should assess their child's capacity to control their own behaviors and communicate information, and should explore developing protective measures using other supports. So, you know, and that's a personal discussion about, well, if you felt it was important for the officer to understand your disability, to understand that you're on the autism spectrum, to understand how would you communicate that? You know, is that a choice you want to make? And under what circumstances that you want to communicate that, and how would you explain it? And if somebody doesn't have the capacity to do that, there are parents who might use a laminated card in the possession of a service provider, something that has easy to comprehend language that conveys the information about the person's ability to communicate, about any limitations or complications in their understanding or their ability to respond to questions, et cetera. So again, those are kind of, it's a process that is very individualized and really begins with thinking about the different risk factors and things that could go wrong. Thinking about safety measures kind of beyond just dealing with the individual. You want to take an active role in planning for safety in the community. If a child's in a recreation program, if you're choosing a day program, if you're choosing a residential program, discuss the training, discuss possible risk situations, how well prepared staff are to handle it, and support the individual. Parents should think about what to say and what to advise others to say in the event that 911 has to be called in a crisis. Use of language making it more likely that protocols will be invoked. So, one tip in New York City is it makes sense if it's a behavioral crisis and you want officers who are trained or supervision that's trained to say, this is an emotionally disturbed person. that may not be language you use on a regular basis, but it's language that is used by the police, and it invokes a protocol that, there are officers trained for that. So ideally, you get an officer who's already trained. If not, you get someone who's been trained in the protocol, and you get a supervisor who's been trained in the actual response techniques to summon to the scene as soon as possible. But they know going in that what they're dealing with. So that language, emotionally disturbed person, you may want to say an emotionally disturbed person with autism. You probably don't want to say, he's cognitively impaired, but he's duly diagnosed, because that may not have any real meaning by the time it gets through the dispatcher to the officers. Parents should discuss triggers, factors that can trigger behavior with anyone who's involved with the child. And one example is the Dynell. What triggered the behavior that ended up costing him his life was there had been an outing from the group home Dynell wasn't included in. When the people came back, I think they had gone to a carnival or something, and they had funnel cakes, and there was no funnel cake for Dynell. Clearly, that was a trigger. So are they anticipating those kind of situations where they need to plan their activities better so that they don't end up with a situation that creates a crisis? Parents should consider raising safety training as part of transition planning at IEP meetings, and I think it should always be tied to travel training as well. That are they working on those issues? Are they anticipating those kind of issues? Okay, training for officers. In 2015, the Crisis Intervention Team, CIT training, was developed by John Jay. It's a 4-day training. New York City uses it. They've trained thousands of officers, but they still estimate that it's going to take until 2023 to train the entire force. And that training includes, it mainly focuses on people with psychiatric disabilities, but it does deal with developmental disabilities, people with autism, et cetera, as well. NASA has a similar program. I've seen evidence of it. I'm not sure how many officers have been trained. Suffolk County recently developed one, and I believe they have about 100 officers trained within the last year. So they're still in the stage of moving through it. Ethan Saylor's mother, remember, Ethan was the young man who didn't want to leave the movie theater in Maryland, and she has campaigned for training for law enforcement specific to people with developmental disabilities, and the National Down Syndrome Alliance Society organized the Ethan Saylor Alliance that takes on the same cause, and they've had a great deal of success beginning in Maryland, where Ethan lived, and I think it will probably be a model for other places. So about a little over half, so 27 states and District of Columbia require some kind of training on mental health and crisis response. And I'll let me jump ahead just a little bit to talk about training for youth. There's the Be Safe is a movie and a curriculum featuring young people with disabilities acting out scenarios. So it's sort of a youth peer-to-peer activity that involves role play, a movie, and discussion groups around the movie. There's also something kind of interesting, Florio, which is a virtual reality program designed for use by young people with autism, and it simulates situations, including things like a TSA checkpoint, which can be a nightmare. So it's broader than just encounters with the police, but that's some of what's been done for youth. But I want to, as long as we have the time, give you a couple of minutes on the the CIT training in New York City, which again is fairly typical, I think, of it may be a little, New York City with the size and the resources has probably put a great deal of money into the development of the training, but you can kind of see what some of the common factors in this type of training is. It's designed to give the person some assurance of safety, maintain some distance between the officers and the individual, and give them time to get control of the situation, not just rush in and seize control. So,
National headlines.
5-7 shots fired, subject down.
And at the center of many of them, people with mental health issues.
We focus on anything from schizophrenia, psychosis, up to autism, dementia.
The NYPD is trying to help New Yorkers in crisis. One reason why they created crisis intervention training for officers. Sergeant Thomas Bowler, an instructor of the 4-day course, says the goal is to educate cops on how to deal with dangerous situations. Scenarios are inspired by real situations that officers have experienced on the streets.
You have some who will argue and say these classes are not effective at all because you still have cops killing mentally sick people.
I think the classes are very effective.
In 2017, NYPD officers responded to over 173,000 calls of an emotionally disturbed person. So far this year, 38,000 calls.
Get down, watch your six.
PIX 11 was given inside access to the training. The course focuses on crisis communication and de-escalation.
Take some cover right now. Get down.
Role playing is key. In this scenario, a military veteran fights with his wife, then has a flashback of a sniper attack.
And we're here to help you out. We'll ride with you in the ambulance. We'll take the ride all the way with you, make sure you're okay.
In this one, a business exec loses his job and wants to jump off a ledge.
I don't want your police officer psychology. You can't help me right now. Just I have nothing anymore. I can't support my kids.
Debriefs are conducted by a clinician after each situation.
That may provide us with different angles and different approaches.
Sergeant Buxton Pryor, who went through the training, says it also teaches empathy. Another lesson, recreating what some schizophrenics go through.
They instruct you to talk to your neighbor and have a conversation with that person while you're wearing these headphones. And the headphones simulate voices that people may hear while they're communicating with others.
The training is going to help. It's going to give the tools to the officers to prevent deadly encounters.
And the training started in late 2015.
Okay. So that kind of gives you a flavor of what's involved in the training, a lot of role play, and hopefully some information about different categories of disability and how it affects behavior and what approaches will work best to de-escalate. Okay, so in the few minutes we have remaining, let me see if I can see what's in if anyone has been in the chat box. Chat.
We have no questions, Donald.
Oh, okay. All right, we have 4 minutes if anybody wants to type a quick question or two. Okay, if not, I mean, you can continue until I run out of time, but in the meantime, let me tell you about the next training in the series, which is emergency care of, let me just make this go away. Emergency care of students with special health needs and chronic medical conditions. That's going to be done by LIAC. How to deal with school health and safety team in relation to emergency preparedness and medication management. It's an important topic. LIAC is a wonderful organization. I'm sure it's going to be a really good training, and that's next week at 12 o'clock. So you can register. There's a link there for registration. And I guess that concludes the webinar. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope it was helpful. Thank you.